Perception is the most important human cognitive process. This lesson gives an elaborate treatment to perception for a deeper understanding of the concept. In the first section, we will look at the definition of perception, nature of perception, and importance of perception. In the second section, we will discuss the factors influencing perception in relation to the perceiver, the target, and the situation. Then we will look at the perceptual organization in terms of figure ground, perceptual grouping, and perceptual constancy, and perceptual context and perceptual defense. The section on social perception will focus on the attributes of the perceiver and perceived and attribution. This section will also discuss the halo effect and stereotyping. The last section in this lesson is important from the perspective of practical implication of the study of perception, as it introduces the concept of impression management, talks about the process, and suggests employee strategies. Often, two people who have seen the same thing end up interpreting it differently. The question is, why does this happen? This happens because of an extremely complex cognitive process called perception. This would obviously result in individual difference in processing the information that is received. Perception plays a very crucial role in shaping the personality of an individual. But what is perception? We can define the process of perception as one by which individuals organize and interpret their sensory impression in order to give a meaning to their environment. It is quite possible that what is perceived may be different from the reality. For instance, if an organization has decided to offer voluntary retirement services to some of its employees, each of them would obviously perceive this differently. If the organization is merely undertaking this as an exercise in manpower reduction and cost cutting, and if the employees think that this is an attempt to get rid of them, then there is a significant difference in the employee's perception and the reality. We now know that each of us may see the same thing and yet think of it differently. This is because of the influence of several factors on perception. These factors include the perceiver, the characteristics of the target, and the situation or the context in which we see the objects or events. This particular section attempts to explain what happens during the perceptual process when the information from the situation is received. This dimension of organization is called perceptual organization. A person's perceptual process organizes the incoming information into a meaningful whole. Figure ground is a very basic form of perceptual organization. The figure ground principle tells us that perceived object stands out as separable from the general background. This means that a figure is always perceived in contrast with its background. The manner in which the figure is perceived will automatically depend on the background. A change in the background is likely to change the way in which the figure is going to be perceived. The contrast principle of perception tells us that anything that stands out from the background will be noticed, or that which is not what people expect is likely to be noticed more than which is expected. The principle of grouping in perception clearly states that there is a tendency to group several stimuli together into a recognizable pattern. This is a fundamental principle and an innate in all of us. So how do we group the stimuli? There are several ways and means in which we do this. We group them together on the basis of proximity, similarity, continuity, and closure. Perceptual constancy is a sophisticated form of perceptual organization. It gives a feeling of stability in a rapidly changing world. Constancy helps an individual to have some constancy in a tremendously changing and highly complex world. Here, learning plays an important role. This principle tells us that size, shape, color, brightness, and location of an object are fairly constant, immaterial of the information received by the senses. The highest form of perceptual organization is context. This gives meaning and value to simple stimuli, objects, events, situations, and other individuals in the environment. This simple process can be explained with the help of the examples of doodles. Just look at some of the doodles given here. Can you make any sense of these doodles? Your response would be obviously no. But if these doodles were to be placed in a verbal context, I'm sure it would have offered some meaning and value to you. For employees, the organizational structure and culture is the primary context. So any piece of communication, be it a circular, a notice, a memo, a suggestion, a pat on the back, a furrowed brow, or a raised eyebrow, all these acquire a special meaning and added value when they are placed in the context of the work organization. Perceptual defense is close to perceptual context. This principle tells us that a person may build a defense, that is, a block, or a refusal to recognize against a stimuli or situational events in context which may be personally or culturally unacceptable, or a refusal to recognize against a stimuli or situational events in context which may be personally or culturally unacceptable or threatening. Perceptual defense plays a very significant role in understanding union management or supervisor-subordinate relationships. Both context and perceptual defense are closely related to social perception. Social perception plays a very important role in organizational behavior. This is simply concerned with how one individual perceives other individuals. That is, how we get to know others. So now, let us look at some of the key characteristics of a perceiver and the perceived. The most important are the attributes of the perceiver and the perceived. The profile of the perceiver on the basis of research can be succinctly given as: knowing yourself makes it easier for you to see others accurately. Your own characteristics affect the traits that you are likely to see in others. People who accept themselves are more likely to see positive aspects of other people. Accuracy in perceiving others is not a single skill. These four characteristics highly influence the way in which you perceive people. On the other hand, there are certain characteristics of the person who is being perceived, which also influences social perception. So what are these? Research has shown that the characteristics of the perceived influencing social perception includes: the status of the person perceived would greatly influence the way in which they perceive the person. The person is usually put into a category to simplify the viewer's perceptual activities. Two common categories are that of a status and a role. The visible attributes of the person perceived greatly influences others' perception of the person. These attributes make social perception a very complex phenomenon. You have to clearly bear this in mind, that your own perception of the other person is greatly influenced by your own characteristics and also the characteristics of the other person. These attributes play an important role in social perception. It simply makes one point clear, and that is, these attributions play an important role in social perception. It simply makes one point clear, that is, we will see others through fillers of our own image. Let us look at some factors found in psychological process as well as personality. Attribution means how a person explains the cause of another's or his own behavior. With the help of this behavior, people draw conclusions about the factors that impact one another's behavior. The two common problems that creep into social perception are halo effect and stereotyping. Under halo effect, a person is perceived on the basis of one's trait. Stereotyping is similar to the halo effect. Stereotyping refers to the tendency to perceive another person belonging to one class or category. For attribution theory, a stereotype includes general agreement on the attribution traits and the existence of a discrepancy between the attributed trait and the actual trait. Stereotyping affects social perceptions in organizations. Social perception in the previous section was concerned with how an individual perceives other individuals, whereas impression management, which is also called self-presentation, is the process by which people attempt to manage or control the perception of others. Impression management has several conceptual dimensions. It has been researched in relation to aggression, attitude change, attribution, and social facilitation, besides others. Recently, two components of impression management, namely impression motivation and impression construction, have been identified. Employees can use two basic strategies to manage impressions. If an employee is trying to minimize his responsibility for an unfavorable event, or if he wants to stay out of trouble, then he may end up using a demotion preventive strategy, which can be characterized by the strategies such as accounts, where an employee tries to justify or excuse his actions. Apologies, when the employee sees that he is concerned and there is no logical way out. Then the employee may apologize to the boss for some unfavorable happening. Or disassociation, in a case when an employee is indirectly associated with something that went wrong. Now let's look at some promotion enhancing strategies. Such strategies may involve entitlements in case an employee feels that he has not been given credit for a favorable outcome, and therefore ensures that it is known through formal channels. Or he may informally sound the important people on this by indicating that he is pleased that his suggestions or efforts work so well. Enhancement, where an employee may have received credit but he points out that he has really done more and has made a bigger impact than previously thought. Obstacle disclosure, where the employee identifies either personal or organizational hindrances faced by him to achieve some outcome. The last strategy may be association, which is the most common strategy. Here, the employee tries to be seen with the right people at the right time. This generally creates the impression that the employee is well connected and is associated with successful projects. At times, there may be no such attempts on the part of the employee, but managers should be careful of such deliberate manipulations of perceptions while evaluating people. We develop our attitudes by observing our behavior and concluding what attitude must have caused them. However, it is also related to any other activities one may undertake, including religious, ethnic, and cultural activities. All of this information may then be internalized and become an important part of social concept. The way other people react and its influence on the self is often referred to as the concept of the looking glass self. People in these cases perceive themselves as others perceive and respond to them, what social psychologists call reflected appraisal. It can have both positive and negative impact on how one sees and relates to oneself and influences one's self-image.